true guru.
Basically,
Slowly guide.
Hello, it's MrRyanmcmahon again. I'm going to be doing some reading on a pretty amazing concept here. Unity consciousness. What is it? And I'm going to use this book called Initiation, which was written by Elizabeth Haich. I think that's how you spell it. It's actually a book of fiction, but it's all about ancient Egypt. And I just really like the way that she describes initiation and yoga or unity consciousness. So I'm just going to read some key parts in this one very small chapter called The Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil. All right, here we go. Whatever you see as you look about is only recognizable because it has separated itself from its complementary half, and the latter has remained behind in the invisible, the unmanifested state. You can achieve knowledge only through comparing two sides, positive and negative, which have become separated from each other. As long as these two sides are together, resting in each other, you can't perceive or recognize anything. It is only recognizable because it has separated itself from the unity in which the nothing and the everything are still at rest within each other. In other words, it has separated itself from the absolute unity we call God. God. The things in the world about us are only recognizable because the positive appears separately from the negative, and we can compare the two together. There can be no perception unless unity is split into two halves, one of them manifested and the other, its reflection and complementary half, unmanifested, so that both become recognizable through comparison. Okay, so what she's talking about here is God as infinite unity. And she's saying that everything that's manifested in the manifested world, what we walk around in our waking consciousness, the world of material objects, is all manifested from God, which is everything and all unity. So I know that's like philosophical and abstract, but she does a very good job of explaining what many other cultures explain, from Hinduism to even ancient Christianity in ancient Egypt, and other traditions. I mean, Sufism, Taoism, Buddhism, they all talk about the yoga or the union. And when they talk about that, they're talking about consciousness and our ability to perceive it as a whole, so not as fragments. Okay, so I'm going to read on some more. How could a mountain be possible without a valley, or a valley without a mountain? Nothing can ever be manifested and made recognizable unless its opposite, its complementary half, is simultaneously present, unmanifested. When something positive is manifested, the negative remains unmanifested, and vice versa. When something negative is manifested, the positive is unmanifested. Wherever one appears, its complementary half must also be present, even though in an unmanifested state. The two are bound together for all time and eternity. So again, she's talking about this idea of duality, the positive and the negative, or the yin and the yang, or the light and dark, or the hot and cold, whatever the duality is that we perceive is just a reflection. It's the only way in which we can actually perceive it, because we ourselves are in a dualistic state. We are a spirit in a body. So she goes on to say, inseparable divine unity therefore manifests itself always and everywhere. For even in this seeming separation, it continues to be active everywhere as ever-present, attractive force between positive and negative. Both positive and negative tend to return to their original state, which is divine unity. Even though something appears in the visible world, it cannot split itself off permanently from divine unity. Sometime, sooner or later, it will unite with its complementary half and return to divine unity. The inherent force dwelling in everything that exists and drawing every created form back into the original unity is what we call God. So again, what she's just really driving home this idea of divine unity, or unity itself. The consciousness of unity is divine by design or by nature. And its manifestations are inseparable from it. So basically, you can't have the many separated from the one. They're ultimately linked together in a strange duality. And it's only in that duality that we can actually see or perceive it. And I'll segue here a little bit. This actually touches on, in a big way, number theory. If you read, or if you go look at some of my other videos, I've got one by R.A. Schwaller de Lubbock's where I'm reading number theory and how oneness, two-ness, and three-ness, or duality and trinity, come into existence. And he uses number as a language to prove and show this scientifically, and he's brilliant. So she's doing the same thing, but she's just not using numbers. She's using a different language, but they're really talking about the same thing. How oneness births into duality, which in itself creates a resonance, which makes trinity. And from the first three concepts, or three numbers, we build up to number 9. And this is why in ancient teachings, number 9 is called the number of completion. Basically, all numbers are born from 3. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, going on. Both good and evil have arisen only through separation from unity, which is itself is neither good nor evil, but is divine. Only through separation is it possible to achieve recognition and knowledge. Consequently, the recognizable world must consist of good and evil. If this were not so, it would not be recognizable and could not exist at all. So here she's talking about the duality of good and evil and our perception of it, which is really our judgment. So the idea of good and evil is relative to your position or your perception of it. It's kind of like one man's trash is another man's treasure. What's good to one person might seem evil to another. It's all a matter of perspective or perception. And the only way we're able to recognize this duality is through comparison. Okay, the entire creation is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Boom, there's a pretty big line there. The entire creation is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the creation in its entirety is a reference to this tree, this growing thing, this thing that is really ultimately a reference to life itself, or life force. Within life, its manifestations is duality, what she is calling good and evil. Going on. But the Creator, God, is not half which has fallen out of unity, become separated from it, and consequently recognizable. On the contrary, God is unity itself. He stands above all created forms which have fallen out of unity. Right within himself, he has perfect unity. He is the nothing out of which everything arises and manifests itself. But in him, the nothing and everything make up non-separated divine unity. Now, I know that's hard to follow, but basically, again, she's stating that this concept that we agree to call God, and whatever name you put on that concept doesn't really matter. It's the concept that matters. The energy, the essence, the organized, intelligent life force, the ground of being, the thing that we recognize that we are even here. We recognize our own existence, our existentialism, our self-awareness, our I, our ego, our center, our self, our soul, whatever you want to call it. That whole thing is not possible without this concept or this force that we call God. And God is always infinite unity. It's not one of these forms that has fallen out of unity. Okay. Simply because God has no complementary half with which he can be compared. There is absolutely no possibility of comparing him, and so there is no possibility of recognizing him. This is the age-old thing where, an atheist or just a very left-brain scientific materialist would say, well, prove to me that God exists. And obviously we've been around this thing around and around and around. It's not something that you can prove by measurement. It's not something you can prove with an instrument. It's not something that you can show. Because in showing, you're in the world of duality. In showing something or proving something, it has to be compared or relative to something else, which means that it's in the manifested world, and thus not unified or unity, and thus not divine, and thus not God. So, hopefully you guys are following this. She's dropping some knowledge. The material world is like a tree of death. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the God dwelling within it, is the tree of life, living in everything that is created. God is one and only one. This one single God is the Self, the innermost being within all creatures. God is everywhere present, and since two things cannot occupy the same space at the same time, and nothing can displace it, nothing can displace God from any place in the universe. Only one and the same God can be present everywhere as the Self in every created form. God is indivisible unity. All creatures, plants, animals, and man himself, all are fruits of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. All are alive because the vital flow from the tree of life streams through their veins. That is because the tree of life lives within them. So I'm pausing here. The language she's using, she's referring to Western thought, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. These are sort of biblical, Abrahamic, Adam and Eve type of language. But it's actually a really good perspective because that story is so ambiguous with most people. They have never studied the esoteric, they've never studied the occult meanings, they've never studied the etymology of these words, they've never studied the cultural context of these words or the allegorical context, and so she obviously has. And basically, it's pretty straightforward. The tree of life is all unification or all unity because life is imbibed throughout the entire universe. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is what is spoken of in the Bible when, the serpent tempted Adam and Eve and said, if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die. And this is what the serpent meant, was that once you know material consciousness, you are dividing yourself from yourself, your center, your infinite being, and you become material. You become a body. Your spirit or consciousness then becomes identified with the body, and then you create an ego or a split. And this is exactly what psychology of like Freud and Carl Jung and so many others talk about when they try to break down consciousness. The ego, the id, the superego, and so on. So this whole allegory of the in the Bible is really referring to what she's talking about, which is this knowledge of separation from unity, or this fragmentation from unity. And this can only happen when you're in a body. And that's what we are. We are, divine spirit walking around in a material body. Okay, so going on. By virtue of having been born into your body, you have become recognizable being. You have separated your consciousness from the great all and nothing, separated it from God, from your own true self. You have fallen out of the divine paradisical original state, in which all possibilities of manifestation, including all plants and all animals and man himself, are still within the all-embracing unity, into the world of many forms and differentiations. You have become a manifestation, a created form. Consequently, everything you are here on the earthly plane is only the recognizable half of that unity, made up of good and evil. And since your consciousness has been placed in your body, you have awakened in this body. That is, your consciousness has become identical with the body. To eat of something is to become identical with it. For what you eat is what you will consist of, what you will be. Through identifying itself with your body, your consciousness has symbolically eaten of the fruits of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and by the same token become subject to the kingdom of death. So, again, the story says, if you eat of this tree, then you shall surely die. She's just saying that your consciousness, the words to eat of something, did not really refer to putting something in your mouth. It was an allegory for consuming something in your being, or embodying it, or identifying with it. And this is how material consciousness was born, or ego. But now listen to the good news. Your body is the result of separation. It is only the visible half of your own true self. The other half has remained in the unmanifested, unconscious part of your being. By uniting these two complementary halves with each other, you can return to divine unity. It is possible to experience this unity physically. It is impossible to experience this unity physically. That is, to make your invisible conscious visible, and physical also, and unite the two halves together. For one consciousness cannot animate two bodies. To try to experience unity in this way would mean death, by virtue of the very fact that the body has become visible and recognizable because it has separated itself from its complementary half. The reunion in this way would have to involve death of the body. Nevertheless, you still can experience in the body this divine reunion with your complementary half in a state of consciousness. You can expand your consciousness until you make the unconscious part of you completely conscious, until you consciously experience the unmanifested, invisible half of yourself, and in this way achieve divine unity in your consciousness. Even while your body remains in the visible world of the created, you can merge your consciousness with your one own true self, out of which you have fallen, thus forming the perfect unity. In this way, right here in this earthly existence, you can experience bliss. You can experience God. So, again, I know the language is a little tricky, but it's philosophical. Hopefully you guys can pause and listen again, but it's the body consciousness. It's the ego. And the ego is not necessarily a bad thing. In most esoteric thinking, the ego is divine. However, it is a reflection of duality. Duality is not evil. It is both good and evil, yin and yang, up and down, hot and cold, male and female, and so on and so on. She is speaking of the unconscious, which refers to concepts of like Carl Jung, in the collective unconscious, in the shadow side of your being, which Carl Jung clearly states that the only way to become whole, the only way to become self-realized, is to do shadow work, to go deeply into your darker emotions, which what we would call negative. But they're there offering you enlightenment, the potential for growth of knowledge, the potential for self-realization, self-awareness, or unity consciousness. The male forms seek the negative female forms and vice versa. This tendency on the part of the positive and negative force even make up the basic structure of matter. In actual fact, there couldn't be any matter at all without this tendency. For this striving towards unity, towards the state of being of God, makes up the attractive power between positive and negative forces, and the whole world is built on this striving to attain the divine, primordial state. This striving itself is the source of all power in the manifested world. Nature uses it and projected into the body, it is the basis of sexual power. Okay, so for all you scientists out there, for all, the left brain have to measure and chop up reality in small pieces and categorize it type of people that approach reality in that way, which we would typically call a scientist. She's basically showing and saying that science and matter, all of it throughout the universe, is imbibed with this drive to unify. And she's actually correct. If you study Walter Russell and Russellian science, and you see the way planetary bodies move, gravity moves, gravity bends light, and primarily the way light moves, this is exactly how light moves through the universe. If you've never heard of Walter Russell, check him out. Tesla was onto this. Many great thinkers have been onto this. Even Einstein in relativity is onto this. That's why energy and matter are relative to each other. They're opposite ends of the same pole, constantly trying to unify. Again, the duality trying to become one. As long as a creature seeks its complementary half outside itself, in the created recognizable world, it will never find unity, simply because its complementary half isn't outside itself, manifested, separate from itself. But, on the contrary, it is unseparated from itself. It is its own unmanifested part. It's in its own unconscious. Same thing, Carl Jung, as well as all the great mystics, are always talking about unity consciousness, yoga, love, oneness, wholeness. The only way wholeness is going to happen, or unity is going to happen, is not by looking outside yourself. You'll never find salvation or a savior coming to you in the clouds. It's always going to be found within, because the universe that we see outside of ourselves is truly infinite. We have no end to it, despite what scientific measurements are trying to say. And this same thing happens to our inner world. Our consciousness is infinite when looked and focused inward. Basically, the microcosm and the macrocosm reflect each other infinitely. Quantum physics also shows and proves this, that every time we go smaller and smaller and look at particles, we find within the tiniest particle is a whole nother world of empty space with particles in it. And it just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And it goes into infinity. This is what happens within ourselves. So, through this union, which takes place in our consciousness, the eternal longing of your manifested being ceases because it has found its complementary half and merged into unity with it. And for this reason, the sexual desire of the body also ceases once and for all. You become complete within yourself. Now, this is pretty profound. This is something that everybody should think about, is why do all animals, man and animal, have this super strong drive to procreate, to mate, to unify with someone through sexual union? Well, for one, it's the only way we can produce the manifested world, keep the species alive. It's the only way that we can produce more humans. But what she's saying here is that unity consciousness, or God consciousness, is a state in which you have reconciled that drive or desire within yourself, and you no longer seek it because you've found complete balance or wholeness. You've unified the duality, the male-female, the magnetic-electric energies within your spirit or your soul or your being. And thus you have no drive or desire to procreate. I know that sounds strange, but this is where the ideas of celibacy and abstinence and all these religious traditions revolving around sexual innuendo or symbology or desire come from. The problem is that they've lost the original meaning. And this is why you have problems when people try to be celibate, is they're not actually understanding and using the energies that they have. They're repressing them. And this is not the way. It's unity consciousness. It's not separatist or repressive consciousness. So, here we go. Continuing on. Right here in the physical existence, you can experience the divine state, immortality, bliss, fulfillment. And inasmuch as the same one individual being lives in all creatures, you simultaneously become identical with the true self of every creature when you awaken within your own true self. You will achieve unity with God and simultaneously unity with the entire universe. You will lift your consciousness out of your body, out of your personal being, and experience all-inclusive cosmic consciousness. You will free yourself as the I, in parentheses, the self, in every creature, in the entire universe, in God. This means you will again be eating of the fruit of the tree of life. Then you will have moved out of the world of effects and into the world of causes, out of the realm of the transitory and into the realm of the eternal, out of the created and into the creative, out of the realm of death and into the realm of life. In short, you will have achieved your resurrection in eternal being, and that is initiation. So, heavy. The concept of initiation in ancient Egypt, actually in all monastic orders, if they have stayed true to themselves, keyword, selves, they will have not corrupted this process of initiation. Initiation is a self-induced process involving teachers or guides. However, every step is initiated and gone through by you, the pupil, on your own. Because it's only in the self can you realize unity consciousness. There is no hive mentality. There is no group collective freedom. All freedom is personal. It's within the self. It's within each person. And I'd like to point out that she's saying exactly what Rudolf Steiner says when he talks about initiation. And he uses very mystical language, but just very simply what he says initiation is training your awareness to be conscious of the time and space that your being enters between birth and death. So here we go again. The duality of birth and death produce this unity consciousness. And in between, when we die and when we are born, or when we are born and we die, our rebirthing process, there is the ability to become aware of death while in the body, while alive in the physical body. This is what yogis do. It's transcending the body. And in that state of transcendence, you can become aware of the state of consciousness. You can be in the state of consciousness between death and birth or rebirth. And this is what Steiner calls initiation. So, there it is. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please share it, pause it, listen to it, contemplate it, meditate on it, because it's pretty brilliant. Unity consciousness, yoga, syncretism, all one love.